Hackers made life a misery for airlines and their passengers. Boeing has a mix of new and familiar challenges. Lufthansa is changing its operations. And how old will the pilots be on your next flight? Yeah, it is time for another monthly news roundup, looking at aviation stories that we didn't get to cover in their own videos, or stories that are still evolving and definitely are worth keeping an eye on. And we're going to start with something a bit odd. Striking workers that voted for a contract offer that their bosses didn't even make. For several months now, we've been monitoring a dispute between Boeing and their workers in St. Louis, Missouri. We don't talk about that particular site very often because Boeing doesn't assemble airliners there. Instead, St. Louis is where they make fighter jets like the F-15 and the FA-18, although they actually do make a couple of components for the new 777X as well. The Boeing workers in St. Louis are members of the International Union of Machinists, Chapter 837, numbering around 3,200 people, and they have been on strike since August the 4th. All this came after lengthy talks, and to be perfectly clear here, it was quite obvious that this strike would come, which is something that we already mentioned back in the July news roundup. But initially, we thought that this strike wouldn't affect Boeing that much, since it would likely only last for a short while. But that is not how this story has evolved so far, to put it mildly. Eventually, some more talks did come, but then the negotiations stopped when the two sides just couldn't find any common ground. The union demanded wage increases similar to what Boeing offered to their other workers last year after the strikes in Washington and Oregon. But this time Boeing wasn't prepared to offer such generous wage increases, and as we record this, they still aren't. Instead, they are offering a 20% rise, faster wage progression plus more vacation time and sick leave. And for reference, last year's strike ended after those workers got a 38% wage increase, plus bonuses and other improvements. So on the 12th of September, the St. Louis workers voted to reject Boeing's offer. And as a response, Boeing management said that they would consider some minor adjustments to it, but nothing major. Then, on the 19th of September, 46 days into the strike, the union workers decided to hold another vote, without any new offer coming from Boeing. Instead, the union asked the workers to vote for the kind of contract that they wanted to see from Boeing's management. The terms in that vote called for a higher wage increase, better bonuses and contributions to the workers' retirement plans, and those terms generally matched Boeing's offer to last year's striking airliner workers. Not surprisingly, perhaps, that vote went 90% in favor of the contract that the union leaders had proposed, and the union thinks that this result sends a strong message to Boeing's leadership regarding how they should proceed. But Boeing's management does not see it that way. Instead, they dismissed this vote as a publicity stunt, with Dan Gillian, Boeing Defense Vice President, adding, "It's unfortunate that union leadership led its members to vote on something that isn't real." Now, there is some political pressure on Boeing to resume talks with its workers and meet them in the middle. The union claims that Boeing's original offer would cost the company $30 million a year, whereas their new own counteroffer would cost them about $40 million. The thing is, though, that there is a big difference here between this and last year's strikes, which probably explains why Boeing's management doesn't seem to be as troubled now as they did back then. You see, last year, the strike stopped the production of the Boeing 737, plus the 767 and the 777 freighters, but this year, the strike is only slowing down production of Boeing's fighter jets, but not stopping it completely. And that's because Boeing are now using non-union workers to keep production going, albeit at a slower pace. And they've even announced plans to hold a fair to hire even more such workers if the strike continues. Now, the union seems to suggest that this is just a big bluff, because new workers will also need to be vetted and get security clearances, since they obviously will be working on military aircraft projects. And that type of vetting can take up to 6 months to do, so it's not just like you can replace and put in new workers. This means that it still remains to be seen how these negotiations will proceed, and it will be really interesting. It's important to remember here also that this is a smaller union chapter than what Boeing dealt with last year. 3,200 workers instead of around 33,000. So perhaps Boeing believes that they're strong enough to hold their ground here. But like I said, it'll be very interesting. Our next story is about some extremely worrying airport disruptions involving hackers and ransomware attacks. There is still plenty of summer traffic in September in much of the world, which keeps airports busy, and that means that problems can affect, well, basically everyone. For example, on the 19th of September, a lot of flights in and out of Dallas-Fort Worth and Dallas-Love Field were disrupted because of an FAA telecoms failure. Yet another example of failing FAA infrastructure that we've looked at recently and likely have to come back to. But as frustrating as those type of issues can be, there are actually people out there who deliberately try to make things even worse. You see, just a day after the troubles in Dallas, some of Europe's busiest airports faced what later turned out to be a cyber attack. This affected London Heathrow, Europe's busiest airport, as well as Brussels in Belgium, Berlin in Germany, and to a lesser extent Dublin and Cork in Ireland. Berlin was also unusually busy on the 20th of September when this happened due to a city marathon that happened during the weekend, which made things just even worse. So what happened then? Well, the cyber attack affected a system called Arinc C-Muse, or just Muse for short. That's software made by Collins Aerospace, a company that's now part of RTX, previously called Raytheon. Muse is a check-in and boarding system that helps airliners process passengers faster, and Collins described it as a cloud-based system that allows airlines to add and remove workstations quickly. Now, we obviously don't know exactly how this hacking was done, but airlines do have alternative methods to check in passengers when problems like these happen. But of course the catch with using those processes is that they are much slower. Some passengers reported that companies used laptops and iPads to check people in, and then they even resorted to giving out handwritten boarding passes. Now, passengers who had checked in at home were handled quicker, but I'm not sure if that applied to anyone who had check-in bags with them. Anyway, this slowdown obviously meant that the busiest airports also faced the biggest delays. And the attack was still causing cancellations on Sunday, around 50 out of 257 flights, or around 20% in Brussels, with over 10% of flights being cancelled still on the Monday. And those flights that did go ahead all had delays of over 1 hour. On Monday, an EU agency confirmed that this was a ransomware attack, where someone had contacted the airports and airlines asking for money to give them back access to their own systems. But at the same time, Collins were also working on bringing in updates to fix the issue, so we don't really know if the hackers were actually paid off in the end or if Collins beat them to it to get the systems back under control. Now, we will likely learn more about this in the coming months, but hopefully events like this will remain rare as companies learn from them and make their systems more resilient and robust. In any case, whenever we come across big stories like this one, my team and I turn to our sponsor, Ground News, which is a great tool when it comes to creating a better and more accurate overview of breaking news. Ground News is a site and an app that pulls in thousands of articles from all over the world, grouping them by story, and then shows you clear breakdowns of bias, ownership, and trustworthiness. When we searched for this ransomware story, Ground News showed us over 60 different outlets, everything from major international sources to local European ones that you might not normally see. Some of these outlets focused on the cybersecurity threats, others on the passenger chaos, and the first angle that you see can obviously shape the way that you perceive the story. Ground News therefore shows the factuality ratings and compares everything so that you can cut through the noise and see the whole picture. When we are making these videos, we don't just want to show flashy headlines. We need accurate and reliable sources to make sure that we give you as accurate and non-biased info as possible, and Ground News helps us achieve that. So I highly recommend that you check them out, and you can do that by scanning this QR code, head over to ground.news/mentor, or click on the link here in the description below. That will give you 40% off the price of the same plan that I use, which comes out at just $5 per month, if you hurry. Thank you, Ground News. Now let's continue. For our next story, we are going to look at Lufthansa and something that went mostly under the radar, but that also tells us a few interesting details about what to expect from the airline industry, particularly in Europe. On the 12th of September, the Lufthansa group announced that they would bring other airlines in their group a little bit closer together with the Lufthansa mothership. Other than Lufthansa itself, this group also includes Swiss, Austrian Airlines, Brussels Airlines, Air Dolomitri, Eurowings and others, and they're also right now busy integrating ETA Airways into the group. In their announcement, Lufthansa explained that the operations of companies like Swiss, Austrian and Brussels Airlines in particular would be slightly changed, mostly in ways that passengers won't be able to see directly. More specifically, the network of operations of the airlines, in other words, the routes that they fly, will become better coordinated with the rest of the group's flights. But that obviously begs the question, why hasn't this already been done? Swiss, Austrian and Brussels Airlines have all been part of the Lufthansa group for quite some time now, so why haven't they been integrated this way before? Why would an airline basically buy a competitor and not integrate it as closely as they could? Well, what this story shows us is just how different airline consolidation has been if we compare, for example, Europe and the United States. In the US, the 9/11 attacks triggered an era of crisis and consolidation, giving us the Big Four: American, Delta, United and Southwest. But crucially, these were full mergers, meaning that the names of the other airlines like US Airways, Northwest and Continental, well, they just disappeared. The crews of those companies were integrated into the parent airline's operations and the planes were repainted in completely new colors. In Europe, a slower consolidation also took place, but kind of half-heartedly. Lufthansa added airlines to their group, and companies like Air France and KLM formed their own group by adding companies like Transavia and HOP. And the IAG group then also did the same with airlines like British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus and Vueling. But these airlines retained their own liveries and separate operations. And that was because, unlike the US, Europe obviously isn't one single country, and a lot of the airline names that I just listed are flag carriers in their respective countries, which meant that making these airline names just disappear would be very, very unpopular, if even practically possible. But those type of considerations has also slowed the integration of European carriers. Even aircraft types within a group are often different between airlines, which obviously then has implications in things like maintenance and training, even if those operations are partially integrated. So the news from Lufthansa actually shows us that this integration is now going ahead, but still very slowly. The individual airlines will still handle flight operations, services and the customer experience separately, although they have already integrated their loyalty schemes and applications. But if you are in Europe like me, then you can likely expect to see some fewer airline names in the future, or at least you will notice that these airline group integrations become much more obvious. Our next story is a Boeing problem, one that is so familiar that honestly I'm not even sure that it qualifies as news anymore. There are delays in the certification of the Boeing 777X. Again. Lately, Boeing had been doing much better in the certification work on this aircraft, specifically on the larger variant, the 777-9. In August, they actually added a fifth test aircraft to the flight schedule to accelerate flight testing, and among other things, that plane will be used to test the type's resilience to lightning strikes and electromagnetic interference. Which sounds like a fun job, I guess. But when Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg spoke at a conference on the 11th of September, he said that the certification schedule is now slipping, which means that Boeing most likely won't manage to get the plane certified within 2025 as they had previously hoped. The first aircraft deliveries weren't expected before 2026 anyway, but according to Leham News, Boeing has now told airlines not to expect any new aircraft before June next year. But the airlines, they have already been more pessimistic than that, so they didn't expect these jets to arrive until earliest October of 2026. Now, previous delays with the certification of the 777X had to do with specific problems, like the broken thrust links for the plane's engines, which I covered in a video last year. But in this case, there isn't a specific new problem causing further delays. Certification is simply getting slower, and as Ortberg put it, a mountain of work is still in front of the company to get the 777-9 certified by the FAA. What all of this means is that when it enters service, the 777-9 will be at least 6 years behind schedule. So airlines like Emirates, who are really anxious to add it to their fleets, aren't getting any happier right now, and Boeing will likely end up owing them quite a bit in compensation for all of these delays. But there is also a silver lining here. Despite these delays, Boeing is still scoring new orders for it. Cathay Pacific ordered 14 more 777-9s in August, bringing its total to 35, and in May this year, Qatar also added 30 777-9s to its existing orders. So the plane will be late, but it is clear that the airlines really want it. In better Boeing news, the company's deliveries are still accelerating nicely and steadily. By the end of August, Boeing had delivered a total of 385 jets in 2025 so far, and that meant that they delivered more aircraft by that stage in 2025 than they did for the entire 2024. Now, of course, 2024 was a spectacularly bad year for Boeing because of the door blowout scandal and then the strike that I mentioned earlier. And this faster production pace follows efforts to accelerate production of the 737 MAX beyond the FAA-imposed limit of 38 aircraft per month. Boeing now want to see that limit raised to 42 aircraft, but they're not in a hurry. Boeing CEO Kelly Ortberg said that they won't go faster unless that they can guarantee stability. And he added, "If we're not ready, we'll wait a month. A month will not matter in the big scheme of things. Losing stability will matter. We are going to make sure we're governing ourselves, doing the right thing and building a quality airplane." Which sounds pretty good to me. Next up is something that actually happened very late in August, but it was too late for us to cover it in the previous month's roundup. And this has to do with just how old active pilots can be. Now, I have previously covered stories about proposals to allow older pilots to remain in the cockpit of airliners for longer as a way of solving the pilot shortage. Recent moves on this matter go back to 2023 and were rejected just a few months later. But the broader discussion on pilot age goes way further back than that. The point here is that these previous efforts were led by the United States. But in late August, the body calling for raising the mandatory airline pilot retirement age from 65 to 67 was instead IATA, the International Air Transport Association, who represents 350 airlines worldwide. They formally submitted this proposal to ICAO, the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization. So why is that so important? Well, the problem is that even if the United States went ahead to introduce such an age increase on their own, the pilots affected, who would obviously then be quite senior in their airlines, would be severely restricted in where they would be allowed to fly. And of course, many of these senior pilots would be flying wide bodies internationally at the time that they pass 65, which they then wouldn't be able to continue doing unless the countries that they flew to also would allow pilots to be older than 65. Now, there are countries out there, like Australia, Brazil and New Zealand, who already allow airline pilots to fly above the age of 65, but it would be hard for an airline in, let's say, the United States to retain pilots beyond that age if they could only be rostered to fly a handful of destinations. The planning would become a nightmare. So realistically, the airlines would therefore need to retrain these pilots to fly single-aisle jets domestically, which would then create other problems involving pilot pay and seniority lists. So this type of a proposal would have far better chances to have an effect in practice if it would receive wider approval, which is why ICAO's consideration really matters. But is it actually safe for pilots to fly airliners beyond a certain age? Well, an argument here is that today we have much better ways to monitor health of pilots than we did historically. These pilots would obviously still need to abide by the same health standards as everyone else does. IATA also suggested that airlines could be required to make sure that 2 pilots over the age of 65 wouldn't be rostered together as a further precaution. Now, pilot unions does not like this idea. They argue that we don't have enough data available to support such an age increase. But on the other hand, a lot of pilots over the age of 65 that can't keep flying their airlines today still continue their professional careers flying business jets instead, so it's kind of already happening. Even more recently, lawmakers in the United States again pushed for another vote on this matter, since the last such effort was rejected back in 2024. But like I said, ICAO's verdict on this matter is really the one decision that we need to look out for. Our last story is something that broke just as we were getting ready to record this video. In another case of people disrupting airport operations on purpose, someone recently flew drones over Copenhagen Airport in Denmark and Oslo in Norway. And they weren't shy about it. At least 2 or possibly 3 drones appeared over Copenhagen Airport, flying there from different directions and switching their lights on as they flew around. In Oslo, there was also 2 drone sightings, but it's not clear if they were seen at the same time. At this point, we don't know if the 2 events are related, but Danish police said that whoever flew the drones was a capable operator, meaning that they had the capabilities, the will and the tools to show off in that way. The result of this stunt was that the airport had to close for several hours. In total, 100 flights were delayed or cancelled in Copenhagen alone, affecting around 20,000 passengers, according to an airport spokesperson. And I am really looking forward to learn more about the origin of those drones as this investigation moves forward. So what do you think? Have you seen an aviation story in September that you think is worth highlighting? Let me know in the comments here below, and also consider joining my Patreon crew by using this QR code or the link here in the description below. It will be lovely to see you join our team and get to see all my videos before everyone else. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.